Hello, and welcome to the Tales After Midnight channel. We're glad you're here. Welcome to the channel. Today, we're uncovering a forgotten catastrophe from early American history, one that was quietly buried by time itself. The year is 1720. Louisiana, the deadliest colonial disaster America almost forgot. This isn't a legend, and it isn't an exaggeration. What you're about to hear is a reconstruction built from scattered colonial records, ship logs, and survivor testimonies that took an immense amount of effort to piece together. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and please consider subscribing to support this kind of deep, true history research. Every story shared here is carefully verified, cross-checked, and rescued from the edge of oblivion. In the early 18th century, Louisiana was sold to people of Europe as a dream. A land of endless rivers, fertile soil, gold hidden in the earth, and opportunity waiting for anyone brave enough to cross the Atlantic. This vision was carefully manufactured by financiers, royal officials, and promoters who had never once stepped into the swamps they so confidently described. At the heart of it all was an ambitious colonial scheme, designed not only to populate Louisiana, but to rescue a collapsing European economy. France, crushed under the weight of debt after years of war, turned to a bold financial experiment that promised instant wealth through overseas colonies. Louisiana became the centerpiece of that promise. On paper, the plan seemed simple. In reality, it was catastrophic. Thousands of settlers would be transported to the Mississippi Valley, where they would build farms, establish trade routes, and create thriving towns. Crops were supposed to grow effortlessly. Trade with indigenous nations would supposedly flourish, and raw resources would flow endlessly back to Europe. Pamphlets distributed in Paris and other cities portrayed Louisiana as a tropical paradise with mild weather and unbelievably rich soil. Rivers were said to be lined with fruit-bearing trees. Wild animals were described as abundant and easy to hunt. Some promoters even claimed that gold dust could be found along riverbanks. For the poor, the desperate, and the imprisoned, Louisiana sounded like salvation. Recruitment was aggressive and often deeply deceptive. Prisoners, debtors, orphans, and even people taken directly from the streets were offered freedom and land if they agreed to go. Many had no real choice. Others sold everything they owned to buy passage, convinced they were traveling toward prosperity and a better life. Families boarded ships believing they would arrive in a functioning colony, with homes already built, food waiting, and protection guaranteed. What they did not know was that the colony barely existed beyond a few fragile outposts that were already struggling to survive. When the ships finally reached the Gulf Coast and traveled up the Mississippi River, reality destroyed the dream almost instantly. There were no prepared towns, no stocked storehouses, and no dependable infrastructure. Settlers were unloaded into dense wilderness dominated by swamps, endless mosquitoes, and terrain completely unfamiliar to them. The climate was brutally humid, far harsher than anything they had ever experienced in Europe. Fresh water was scarce. Food supplies were limited. The soil that had been praised so highly back home was extremely difficult to farm. Without knowledge of local conditions and methods, colonial planners had assumed that indigenous knowledge would fill in the gaps. Instead, relationships with native nations were fragile and often hostile, damaged by broken promises, misunderstandings, and mistrust. Supplies sent from France arrived late or not at all, and when they did arrive, they were often spoiled, stolen, or useless by the time they reached the settlers. Disease spread rapidly among people already weakened by hunger, exhaustion, and shock. Fever, dysentery, and malaria tore through the population within weeks. The Grand Plan had made no real provisions for medicine, sanitation, or even basic shelter. Leadership on the ground was chaotic and deeply flawed. Colonial officials argued among themselves, mismanaged what little supplies existed, and ignored warnings from those who understood the land. Orders from Europe arrived months too late to matter. Instead of adapting to reality, leaders clung to the fantasies sold to investors and the crown, insisting that success was just around the corner. Meanwhile, settlers were dying by the hundreds. Graves appeared faster than homes. Entire shiploads of people vanished into Louisiana wilderness without leaving behind any written trace. What made this plan especially deadly was not only poor preparation, but deliberate misinformation. Financial interests depended on continued investment and continued immigration. Admitting failure would collapse confidence and expose the entire scheme as a lie. So letters sent back to Europe were carefully edited. Death tolls were minimized. Survivors were pressured to describe hope, opportunity, and success. Even as they buried neighbors, friends, and family members, the disaster was being concealed in real time. By 1720, the colony was in complete collapse. Starvation forced people to eat roots, bark, and sometimes things far worse. Violence erupted over food. Some settlers fled into the wilderness and were never seen again. Others died while clinging to belief that help would eventually arrive. The ambitious colonial plan that promised wealth and glory had instead created one of the deadliest settlement disasters in early American history. Louisiana had not failed because the land was cursed or uninhabitable. It failed because human greed, arrogance, and deception replaced preparation and truth. The dream sold in Europe was never meant to save settlers. It was meant to rescue a financial system. And the ones who ultimately paid the price were those who believed in that promise. The settlers who arrived in Louisiana in 1720 were quickly confronted with a nightmare far beyond anything they could have imagined. Disease struck first, moving faster than any army and with far deadlier precision. Fever, dysentery, and malaria tore through entire groups of people within days. European immune systems, completely unprepared for the harsh subtropical environment, offered almost no resistance. The few doctors who were present had little understanding of local conditions or treatments, and the medicines shipped from France were often spoiled, diluted, or entirely useless against the illnesses spreading through the colony. Within weeks, families were shattered, and communities that crossed the Atlantic together found themselves reduced to only a handful of survivors. Starvation soon made the situation even worse. The colony's organizers had promised fertile land and abundant food, but Louisiana's soil, thick with clay and dominated by swamp conditions, resisted the European farming methods settlers depended on. Crops failed again and again due to flooding, intense heat, and pests unknown to the newcomers. Attempts to forage in the swamps were extremely dangerous. Wild animals, venomous snakes, and treacherous marshes turned even basic survival into a constant risk. Many settlers were forced to eat whatever they could find. Roots, bark, and small animals when possible, though hunting was difficult without any real understanding of the terrain. Starvation combined with disease transformed the colony into a place where death felt constant and unavoidable. Environmental collapse became another silent killer. Colonial planners had made little effort to understand the region's unique ecosystem. Heavy rains frequently caused devastating floods that destroyed shelters and washed away what little food remained. Hurricanes, though not frequent, arrived with terrifying force, flattening fragile structures and scattering survivors into surrounding swamps. Freshwater sources were often contaminated or located too far from settlements, forcing people to drink from stagnant pools filled with bacteria. These environmental pressures made survival a daily struggle, and even the strongest settlers began to weaken rapidly. These natural threats were made far worse by failures in leadership and organization. Many colonial officers and planners were more concerned with profit and prestige than with the survival of the people under their authority. Supply chains were mismanaged, leaving critical food, tools, and building materials delayed or missing entirely. Some leaders hoarded resources, while others imposed impossible demands on a population that was already starving and exhausted. Orders from Europe arrived months too late to be useful, and when they did arrive, they were often completely disconnected from the settlers' immediate reality. Without effective leadership, communities fell into chaos and morale collapsed. The combination of disease, starvation, and environmental destruction created a perfect storm. Families were torn apart, with many people dying alone in isolated huts or perishing in the swamps while trying to reach safer ground. Infants, the elderly, and those weakened by the voyage were especially vulnerable. Surviving records and letters suggest that entire shiploads of settlers were wiped out in just a matter of months, their deaths unrecorded and unnoticed by the distant crown. The human cost was staggering, yet the true scale of the suffering was hidden by those determined to protect the colony's reputation. This devastation was not random. It was a predictable outcome of a plan created without understanding, preparation, or respect for reality. Settlers arrived filled with hope, but the lack of planning, combined with a hostile environment and rampant disease, ensured that Louisiana would become a graveyard for those who trusted the dream. The disaster was both sudden and prolonged. It killed not only through direct causes like illness and starvation, but also by slowly destroying hope, community, and trust. By the end of 1720, the colony's population had been reduced to a fraction of its original size. Those who survived were sick, malnourished, and deeply traumatized. The dream of a thriving Louisiana settlement had been replaced by a brutal fight for basic survival. Disease, starvation, and environmental collapse were no longer distant threats. They were daily realities that haunted every waking moment. In hindsight, the disaster seems inevitable, but at the time, settlers had no understanding of the forces working against them. It was a catastrophic failure of human planning in the face of an unforgiving wilderness. At its core, the suffering of the Louisiana settlers in 1720 shows how fragile human ambition becomes when confronted by the raw power of nature. Disease, hunger, and environmental destruction work together to erase communities, wipe out generations, and leave a scar on history so deep it was almost forgotten. The tragedy was not only in the number of lives lost, but in the crushing weight of betrayed hope. Hope that had been sold as opportunity, but delivered as an unrelenting nightmare. The disaster of Louisiana in 1720 was not merely the result of disease and starvation. It was also intensified by catastrophic failures in leadership that transformed an already desperate situation into a full-scale human tragedy. The colonial administration responsible for organizing and supplying the settlers had little real experience managing a frontier colony of this size. Many officials were appointed through political connections rather than proven competence, and their priorities often focused more on impressing superiors in Europe than on protecting the lives of the people struggling on the ground. Orders and regulations were frequently inconsistent, and conflicting directives created confusion among both settlers and lower-ranking officers. This chaos left entire communities without clear guidance, forcing them to confront brutal conditions largely on their own. One of the most obvious failures of leadership was in resource management. Supplies meant to sustain settlers for months often arrived late, spoiled, or in quantities far too small to meet the colony's needs. Shipments of food were miscounted or diverted. Tools and farming equipment were lost during transit, and building materials intended for shelter were missing, damaged, or completely unusable. In some cases, commanders hoarded supplies for themselves or distributed them preferentially to favored individuals, deepening inequality and breeding resentment within the fragile colony. Settlers were left to improvise with whatever they could find. But the lack of planning meant many families faced constant exposure to the elements. With no proper shelter, no reliable tools to cultivate crops, and no access to clean drinking water, survival became a daily gamble rather than a coordinated effort. Leadership also failed to prepare for the environment itself. Louisiana's swamps, floods, and subtropical climate presented challenges that European officials either ignored or grossly underestimated. There were no effective flood defenses, no shelters designed to withstand relentless humidity, and little understanding of the diseases native to the region. Commanders assumed European farming methods would work just as well in the New World, ignoring the reality that the soil composition, pests, and growing conditions were completely different. Without guidance on how to adapt, crops failed repeatedly, and food shortages became an immediate and deadly threat. The combination of environmental mismanagement and a lack of local knowledge rapidly accelerated the suffering of the settlers. Communication failures made everything worse. Messages sent from France took months to reach Louisiana, and by the time they arrived, conditions had often changed beyond recognition. Many instructions were useless or impossible to carry out, demanding actions that had no relevance to the emergency unfolding on the ground. Colonial officers struggled to interpret these orders, while simultaneously dealing with outbreaks of disease, starvation, and rising unrest. This disconnect created a vacuum of real authority, leaving settlers effectively abandoned in a hostile land where each day was a fight for survival. The human cost of these leadership failures was devastating. Starving settlers fought over scarce food supplies, and violence became increasingly common. Disease spread faster without organized quarantine measures or reliable medical care. Weak or poorly enforced laws failed to maintain order in a colony already teetering on the edge of collapse. Families were torn apart not only by the dangers of the environment, but by the absence of capable leadership and the growing distrust toward those appointed to protect them. Every mismanaged shipment, every delayed or ignored order, and every poor decision by colonial leaders directly increased the death toll. Yet even as conditions worsened, many leaders tried to hide the truth. Reports sent back to Europe were sanitized or deliberately misleading, emphasizing minor successes while minimizing or ignoring the scale of human suffering. This deception allowed financial and political backers to maintain faith in the colony and continue sending settlers and supplies that were far too limited to address the growing catastrophe. By protecting appearances, leaders ensured that when help might have made a difference, it arrived too late or in forms that could not save lives. The psychological impact of these leadership failures was just as severe. Settlers had been promised opportunity, stability, and protection. When none of this materialized, hope turned into despair, morale collapsed, and desperation often led to fatal decisions. People wandered into the swamps searching for food, attempted dangerous journeys to neighboring settlements without guidance, or succumbed to illness without seeking what little medical help existed. The absence of strong leadership created an atmosphere where fear and confusion multiplied the effects of disease and hunger, turning the disaster into an inescapable trap. In the end, the incompetence of colonial leadership transformed an already difficult environment into one of the deadliest catastrophes in early American history. It was not just nature that killed the settlers. It was not merely bad luck. It was a combination of poor planning, mismanaged resources, delayed communication, and a refusal to adapt to local conditions. This disaster stands as a powerful reminder of how human error and mismanagement can magnify natural dangers, turning ambition into catastrophe and opportunity into tragedy. The failure of leadership in Louisiana in 1720 left a deep scar on the colony and played a major role in why the disaster was eventually pushed into obscurity. Survivors had little desire or strength to relive the full horror of what they had endured, while European officials were eager to conceal their mismanagement from investors and the crown. What remained were only fragmented records, scattered letters, and countless silent graves. They stand as evidence of the devastating human cost of decisions made far from the land and far from the reality of survival. The testimonies left behind by survivors of the 1720 Louisiana catastrophe are among the few windows we have into the unimaginable scale of human suffering that unfolded there. Most of those who lived through the ordeal were deeply traumatized, and their words reveal a world of chaos, terror, and despair that official reports deliberately tried to hide. These testimonies survive in the form of letters, personal journals, and in some cases, oral accounts later recorded by historians. What immediately stands out is their raw honesty. They describe not only death from disease and starvation, but the constant psychological torture of watching friends, family members, and neighbors die all around them, often in horrific ways. One survivor wrote of waking each morning to the stench of death mixed with the rot of the swamps, and seeing bodies scattered across the settlement like abandoned dolls. Children were especially vulnerable. Parents were sometimes forced to make impossible choices about which child they could try to feed or protect, knowing they did not have a means to save them all. Some settlers described entire families being wiped out by fever within days, leaving a single survivor to care for the dying and bury the dead. The emotional strain of this unending exposure to death was as destructive as the diseases themselves, leaving survivors psychologically shattered and socially isolated. Survivor accounts repeatedly emphasize the collapse of basic social order. Without effective leadership or adequate resources, lawlessness became common. Theft of food, violent confrontations, and crimes driven by desperation spread rapidly. One person wrote of having to fight off other settlers for scraps of spoiled provisions. Another recalled hiding in the swamps to escape a group intent on stealing his small ration of rice. These stories show that the disaster was not only environmental, but deeply social, as fear and scarcity destroyed trust and tore apart what little sense of community remained. Another consistent theme in the testimonies is the near total absence of medical care. Illnesses that might have been manageable in Europe became death sentences in the colony. Fever, dysentery, and malaria claimed lives swiftly, and without access to clean water, proper nutrition, or local remedies, survival was almost impossible. One woman described nursing her husband for weeks, only to watch him die while she herself hovered near death. Another wrote that the colony's few medical officers were overwhelmed, able to treat only a handful of patients at a time, and powerless to stop the spread of disease. The testimonies also reveal the extreme measures people took in order to survive. Settlers scavenged through the swamps for anything edible, fished in dangerous waters, and attempted to hunt wild animals without experience or proper equipment. Starvation drove some to eat roots, bark, and animals they would never have considered food under normal circumstances. There are accounts of people collapsing from exhaustion or drowning while trying to reach safer land or better food sources. Many of these deaths, like countless others, were never recorded. The survivors' writings capture a constant struggle between hope and despair. A small success, such as finding clean water or a bit of food, was always overshadowed by the overwhelming losses happening elsewhere. And yet, despite the horror, many testimonies also speak of extraordinary resilience. Some recount moments of kindness, neighbors sharing their last scraps of food, strangers rescuing abandoned children from the swamps, or small acts of courage that allowed someone to survive one more day. These moments stand in stark contrast to surrounding suffering and reveal the complexity of human behavior under extreme pressure. Even in despair, survivors clung to these fleeting sparks of hope, recording them alongside their accounts of death and disease. Their testimonies also expose the sharp divide between what settlers lived through and what European officials reported. Survivors often noted that letters sent back to France minimized the scale of catastrophe or portrayed life in the colony as far more stable and hopeful than it truly was. This censorship was intentional. Officials wanted to protect their reputations and preserve investor confidence. The survivors' accounts, by contrast, offer a brutally honest view of life in Louisiana in 1720, revealing the enormous gap between reality and the official narrative. Finally, these testimonies help explain why the disaster faded from historical memory. The trauma of survival itself made many unwilling or unable to speak in detail about what they had experienced. Those who did write or speak about it often did so many years later. Their memories were fragmented, their accounts sometimes contradictory, shaped by trauma and the passage of time. This combination of overwhelming suffering, widespread death, and the deliberate suppression of information ensured that the story of the deadliest colonial disaster in Louisiana would remain largely forgotten for centuries. In essence, survivor testimonies are invaluable not only for the factual details they preserve, but for the human perspective they offer. They allow modern readers to grasp the unimaginable conditions the settlers endured, the rapid succession of deaths, and the crushing psychological burden of living in a colony that was collapsing around them. These testimonies remind us that behind every statistic of the 1720 disaster was a real human life, a family destroyed, and a community forced to confront the limits of endurance in the face of an environment and leadership that had completely failed them. The erasure of the 1720 Louisiana disaster from mainstream American history is a powerful example of how human suffering can be buried when it conflicts with political and financial interests. While the events themselves were catastrophic, leaving thousands dead and the colony on the brink of total collapse, European authorities and colonial promoters had every reason to minimize or conceal the true scale of the tragedy. Reports sent back to France were heavily censored, carefully sanitized, or deliberately altered to highlight minor successes and downplay death and failure. Investors needed to believe in Louisiana's future, and admitting to such a devastating failure would have shattered their confidence and likely ended financial support for future ventures. The settlers who survived were effectively left without a voice. Their suffering was pushed aside, and their stories were suppressed, leaving behind only scattered documents and incomplete accounts. One of the primary tools of his erasure was controlled correspondence. Letters written by colonial administrators were edited to ensure that European backers believed the colony was functioning. Deaths were described as isolated incidents or blamed on the normal hardships of frontier life rather than on systematic failures of planning, leadership, and environmental understanding. Any success, no matter how temporary or minor, was exaggerated to maintain the illusion of progress. These selective narratives created a false image of stability that allowed political and financial supporters to continue backing the colony despite its ongoing collapse. The survivors themselves, though unintentionally, also contributed to the disappearance of the story. Trauma, grief, and exhaustion made recounting the full horror almost unbearable. Many had lost entire families, friends, and their sense of community. For some, silence became a form of survival. Those who did write often did so years later, leaving behind journals and letters that were incomplete, scattered, or hidden away in private collections. Over time, as generations passed and settlements shifted, these first-hand accounts became increasingly difficult to locate or verify, deepening the historical silence surrounding the disaster. Environmental factors also played a role in erasing the evidence. Louisiana's swampy and unstable terrain made it difficult to preserve permanent settlements or maintain reliable records. Floods, storms, and the relentless climate destroyed buildings and outposts, often taking administrative documents, personal letters, and daily records with them. The natural environment itself swallowed much of the physical proof of the colony's existence, leaving historians with very little material evidence to support survivor testimonies or colonial reports. Social and cultural attitudes of the era further suppressed the story. Many Europeans viewed colonial failures as an unavoidable cost of exploration and empire building, rarely questioning the ethical or logistical decisions that led to mass death. In the colonies, survivors were often powerless, marginalized, or scattered, leaving no organized group capable of preserving or promoting the memory of what happened. In this context, a disaster that might have been remembered and mourned elsewhere faded into obscurity, surviving only in whispered stories, fading oral traditions, and obscure archival references. Over the centuries, the combined effects of censorship, survivor trauma, environmental destruction, and social neglect ensured that the 1720 Louisiana disaster never became part of the broader narrative of American colonial history. Unlike other catastrophes that were documented, debated, and memorialized, this tragedy was quietly erased. Later scholars who investigated colonial Louisiana encountered fragmented records, conflicting reports, and tantalizing hints of a much larger catastrophe. Reconstructing the story required painstaking cross-referencing of ship manifests, personal journals, and European correspondence. Even then, the narrative remained largely confined to specialized academic circles. The disappearance of this disaster from mainstream history also reflects a wider pattern in how historical events are recorded. Human suffering is often ignored or minimized when it challenges dominant narratives of progress, expansion, and national pride. In the case of Louisiana, acknowledging the full scale of the 1720 disaster would have exposed not only the limits of European colonial ambition, but also the devastating human cost of placing profit and political prestige above survival. That truth was uncomfortable, and it was far easier to forget, ignore, or deliberately suppress it. Today, the tragedy of 1720 Louisiana can finally be reconstructed and recognized thanks to the careful work of historians and researchers who have pieced together what little documentation survived. Through records, letters, ship logs, and scattered testimonies, The story that was once buried is slowly being brought back into the light. While the disaster itself can never be undone, acknowledging its scale and its human cost restores the voices of those who were silenced for centuries. It reminds us that history is not only about victories and achievements, but also about forgotten lives that shaped the world in ways that were both tragic and profound. Here on Tales After Midnight, telling these stories is about more than remembering events. It is about giving dignity back to the people who were erased from official narratives and acknowledging the suffering that was hidden for the sake of appearances and profit. In the end, the disappearance of this colonial catastrophe reflects the fragility of historical memory. Without deliberate preservation, the suffering of thousands can vanish almost completely, leaving behind only broken echoes in letters, journals, and the land itself. By revisiting and amplifying these suppressed stories, we honor the lives that were lost and ensure that the lessons of 1720 Louisiana, the consequences of mismanagement, greed, and environmental unpreparedness, are not forgotten by future generations.